Our next speaker is Wendy Fields, and she will be speaking about building a movement. Wendy is Executive Director at Democracy Initiative, and before joining Democracy Initiative, she was the Vice President of Strategic Campaigns and Partnerships at Common Cause, where she focused on linking economic inequality and racial inequality to the democracy agenda. Before that, she spent 17 years at the United Automobile Workers in Detroit, Michigan, and she served as Chief of Staff to UAW President Bob King. She was the first woman to hold the highest non-elected position with the union.
I'm here to talk about building movements, and I think that we all know in this room that at the heart of it, building movements is about power and disruption. And it's funny because I started my day this morning with the patriotic millionaires, talking about how important tonight's debate is going to be around the issue of democracy. And then I spent the middle of the day with a group of awesome voting rights activists about the need to protect the right to vote. And they are awesome, and now I'm here with you all. So I think I'm coming full circle around on the activism front. But it is about power and disruption. The DI, the Democracy Initiative, is a network of 59, coalition of 59 organizations that represent 30 million members. We are activists from unions, civil rights groups, environmental, nonprofits, immigrants, and women's rights groups, and the LGBTQ community, and good government groups. So groups like Public Citizen are in the DI, I'm sure you're all aware of. People for the American Way, Sierra Club, Greenpeace, the NAACP, and the Communication Workers of America, and the AFL-CIO. So those are just a few. Our members are committed to the vision that every voice and voter should be heard and counted regardless of the size of their wallet or zip code, their race, creed, or color. DI members are all passionate about their core issues, but they also realize that their core issues are inextricably linked. Their success and the ability to move those policies are inextricably linked to the impediments in our democracy, and that to be successful and to build power, that we have to have political equity. It is clear, and I'm sure you can sure you can all agree, that we have an outsized influence over our country's functions. What DI members are working to do is tear down the artificial silos that create the perception that these issues are unrelated to each other. And democracy reform. Our members understand that all of the important issues being debated today are impacted by democracy, by the system that controls who can vote and how, who can influence decisions because they have deep pockets, and who is left out completely. As I said earlier, achieving success in climate change, civil rights, women's rights, workers' rights, and racial and economic inequality are inextricably linked to the pillars, fundamental pillars of our democracy. To advance any of those critical issues that are at the top of the mind today, we need not only protect democracy, but improve it, expand it, and expand the right to vote and the access to vote, and decrease the role of power and money that is in our politics. So many of our efforts are being invisibly strangled by the power of a few with very deep pockets. Millions of hardworking people contribute to our society every day, but that society is not addressing our issues. We know that to succeed in any of these areas, we have to fix the system, not just Congress, but in states, counties, and towns. And not just in an election cycle. It's not just about this election cycle. It's about governing. It's about the everyday impact these policies are manipulating the system in ways that most people don't even know about, let alone know how to fight against it. We need a clear understanding about election laws and procedural laws that might be cloaked in jargon that makes it sound remote and unconnected to our everyday lives. But that belief is exactly what allows those with money and power to do what they want and not be held accountable by the public. I think about the manipulations are real for everyday Americans. They are real when resources go to a town with an even higher income level than Flint, Michigan, to make sure their water is clean. They are real when politicians use their obscure rules to halt progress on gun safety, policies that the majority of Americans from both sides of the aisle support, clearly. They are real when harmful voter ID laws are put in place that bar members of our society, our parents, our neighbors, our friends, from exercising their constitutional right to vote. We must stand together to disrupt that power dynamic. That's the movement we need to build in order for all of our other movements to have a real shot. First, we need to demand that our leaders, from the presidential candidates to candidates running for city council or state legislators, tell us where they stand on the question of democracy. Are they going to continue the status quo of pandering for our votes up until Election Day and then ignoring our needs and priorities to appease their donors from November 9th on? Or are we going to hold them accountable to truly represent their constituents? Second, we need to take those answers and speak with our power, the power of the vote. We all know that the greatest power that everyday people have is in our ability to elect or reject leaders by voting. We need to vote. And we need to encourage every single person we know and those we don't know to vote too. We have to encourage and inspire people to vote because the more people vote, the more protection we have. It is about our power. Most of the time when we do pay attention to democracy reform, we concentrate on what's happening at the federal level. And that certainly is important. Public priorities and opinion often fail to translate to policy because once Election Day is over, as I said before, policymakers aren't influenced by the public. They are influenced by money flowing into their pockets. And even more frustratingly, they use loopholes and tricks to manipulate democracy. You know, and you've seen it in the Senate. Senators abuse the rules, hold silent filibusters, fail to bring critical legislation to a screeching halt, bring it to the floor. They leave nominations, as we know, critical nominations in our judicial system, hanging out there to dry. And we have no Supreme Court, one Supreme Court justice missing. On an often unrelated project or provision that scores points back home, they can be fully ready to pass legislation when it serves their interest and serves that of the special interest. This stranglehold on our democracy must end. However, this isn't just a problem that we need to fight on at the federal level. That goes without saying. The saying that all politics is local, but unfortunately we know that, so the power of big money. In Chicago, which is in the news every day, for example, a few powerful players with deep pockets control the elections. While only 15% of Chicagoans make more than $100,000 a year, in their last mayoral election, 63% of the donors did. This donor class does not represent the diversity, values, or interests of that community. So this year and every year after, we need to disrupt the status quo on more than the federal level with our votes. We can't waste our power by just focusing our attention and votes on the presidential election. And I say this, the DI will work really hard in this cycle to make sure that people vote the entire ballot, from the bottom to the top. This is election about us and our election of the kids that this great panel talked about today, that it is important for them to hit every box and send a very, very strong message to every state legislature and county across this country. The role that money plays in politics has been exposed this past election cycle like none other time before. We know that this election cycle, as I said this morning, is the cycle that really no one could argue that reform around the amount of money that flows into our elections, no one can continue to go unchecked. We must have strong disclosure. We must have great transparency. We must have the ability to see who is buying whom and hold them accountable for every act they take. Finally, we have been, I'm going to go off script a little bit. We've had some really successes around public financing. Public financing is what, if many of you are old enough, like me, Jimmy Carter ran in a publicly funded presidential election. Remember that? Who remembers that? It was a pretty good system, wasn't it? So many of the good government groups have been doing very successful public financing reforms in this country. New York has some, not perfect, right? But still. Connecticut, recently Maine, Seattle, and today, last year, 79% of the voters in Chicago voted for public financing, small donor matches in Chicago. We have yet to move that legislatively, but that was the question that was on the ballot. Today in Howard County, Maryland, how many of you from Maryland? How many of you from Montgomery County, Maryland? So Montgomery County, we passed public financing in Montgomery County. You should be applauded. And we're going to build on that this November with a similar ballot initiative in Howard County, Maryland. So across the country, we are beginning to build momentum around public financing and small donor campaign match to reduce the amount of money and to allow anyone to run for office and begin to sort of have a reflective democracy. So this year, and voter laws. You know there's a voter ID fight in Missouri. How many of you know that? Few, so let me tell you. We all know that voter ID is a form of voter suppression. We agree? Yes. All right. Now you're alive. You started to make me nervous. I had to go off script here. Come on, you got to help me out. And really, it says that in order to vote, that basically the notion they put out there is that there's voter fraud in this country. When we know that there's very little evidence to that point. And that's all designed to create chaos and fear, to divide and marginalize, and to distill our power, right? You agree with that? Yes. Now we're cooking. So in Missouri, the chamber and some corporate folks, we'll leave some of them to be unnamed, put a ballot initiative to require voter IDs in the Constitution. How about that? Again, we need to be thinking about not just defensive fights like that every day, but really the DI is working with good government groups to expand the right to vote, the successes of automatic voter registration, not just limited to Secretary of State's offices and for those that have vehicles, but for those who have public services, that you become a resident, you automatically register to vote. We are looking to expand things like same-day voter registration for, especially in communities of color, urban communities, rural communities, where people kind of move around a lot. They don't really know where their polling place is, right? So same-day registration is important. We're moving those kinds of agendas across the country. So it really is important to have a sort of multi-pronged democracy reform where we talk about the things that help us win and build our power as opposed to the negative. Agree with that? Yes, ma'am. All right. Ma'am, we don't really need. But anyway, so it is why the democracy initiative was formed, was to not just be talking about it from a policy perspective, because that's important, right? But as I said in the beginning, it's about to put the real story, the narrative, the impact, what that power and that stranglehold has done to our communities. If you care about clean water, clean air, the largest inequality and the divide in this economic inequality that we have seen in our lifetimes, if you care about the fact that government was put in a place to create public service, a fully functioning government is how you deliver on the promise of democracy for everyone. And so if you are for that vision, then you have to be for a proactive reform driven by the people and not expect the institutions to do it for you. You agree with that? Yes. We're in a good place. So the role of money, as I've said, there's some really great initiatives and we need more to come. But So if we are to sustain our momentum past November 8th, as I said again, we get focused on the election and less about the governing, right? So it's a two-step process. We have to be moving to create a real disruption that then opens the door for progress for all of our movements. We need to hold our leaders on every level accountable, not just when they're running for office. That's how you build trust. At the DI, we will be excited, we hope, in the fall, depending on who wins the Senate, to work to change the Senate rules, to have a talking filibuster, to be able to create an ability to bring bills forward. So we all know the problems, but we know the solutions. Despite what they say, we all still have power. We really do make a difference. And you see those movements out there. You see it in the criminal justice reform sector. You see it around climate change. You see it around the millennials. You saw it in the primary. So this is our moment to build on those reforms today and going forward. So for us, it's breaking down silos across groups, really pushing a reform agenda that helps and makes changes in our community. So I appreciate your time.
Our next speaker is Mitch Rofsky. He's going to address the subject of civic engagement, the responsibility of business. Mitch is president of Better World Club, which is the only green alternative to AAA. Better World stands apart from AAA's highway lobby agenda and offers many innovative services and discounts, including the only nationwide roadside bicycle assistance. He has been devoted his entire career to socially responsible business. He was present at the creation of a number of important progressive business institutions, including the National Cooperative Bank, Working Assets, Business for Social Responsibility, and the Better World Club. He has lobbied Congress on behalf of Public Citizen, and he is here with us today.
As has been mentioned, I've been in business for the past 30 years. Banking, mutual funds, insurance, and I'm fudging to make myself look younger so I don't get depressed at the beginning of the talk. You might ask, this is a public interest conference. What are you doing here? After all, business people are uncaring, money-hungry, and egomaniacs. Well, let me amend that. Business people have been stereotyped as uncaring, money-hungry egomaniacs. The sad thing is that stereotype has been fashioned as much by business people as by anybody else. In DC, the stereotype is nurtured, as many of you here know, by the trade associations such as the Chamber of Commerce and the Business Roundtable and the National Federation of Independent Businesses, just to name a few. I learned about this firsthand when I was working for Ralph and Public Citizens Congress Watch up on Capitol Hill. My concentration was the banking and judiciary committees. And over again, I ran into these groups and their refusal to negotiate reasonable legislative compromises to address critical economic problems. And frankly, I was surprised. I was shocked that these groups all promoted laissez-faire economics, as if all business people were on the right wing, as if all business people thought they, believed in Milton Friedman and they were Barry Goldwater Republicans. Well, my parents were business people, but they were Hubert Humphrey Democrats. They weren't Barry Goldwater Republicans. And so I thought that represented at least as many business people in this country, maybe even more. So I sat down with Ralph, and he and I discussed the need for business organizations that represent them. And out of our discussions, and then out of the work of an association of progressive business leaders, the Social Ventures Network, Business for Social Responsibility was created. Subsequently, the American Sustainable Business Council was organized for legislative advocacy, while BSR focused on corporate practice. And I was the first chair of Business for Social Responsibility and currently on the board of the American Sustainable Business Council. But obviously, the stereotype of business as uncaring, money-hungry egomaniacs hasn't changed much. And I haven't even mentioned Donald Trump by name. The fact is, business people, along with liberals and all Americans, need a new frame. After all, as Karen just mentioned, our problems remain significant. Everybody here is aware of global warming and what's going on with our environment. Everybody here is probably just as aware of what's going on with income inequality. The working class is falling out of the middle class. Now, the upper middle class is growing, but most of the working class isn't going up with it. It's not the 20th century anymore. We've dropped 6 million manufacturing jobs since the year 2000. During Reagan, manufacturing was over 20% of our economy and finance was under 10%. Today, those numbers have turned around. And obviously, that hurts the working class. So, shouldn't this be an opportunity for liberalism? Well, for one thing, I'm disappointed in the nature of how the campaigns have gone thus far. But what it really comes down to is that liberal framing is terrible. Conservatives want you to believe that the appropriate political frame is the one we've had historically, and that everyone here is familiar with. It's freedom versus the government. It's the individual versus the government. But in fact, that's not what economic policy is about. That's not the appropriate frame. The appropriate frame is, it's the marketplace versus the government. Now, conservatives believe that the marketplace is perfect, and by perfect, I mean optimal and self-correcting. Socialists believe that the government is perfect, and by that I mean optimal and self-correcting. It's only liberals who understand that neither is perfect, that both the government and the marketplace are flawed, and you need each to mitigate the flaws of the other. Liberalism is not becoming socialism. Despite Bernie Sanders, liberalism is not becoming socialism. As a matter of fact, if anything, it's vice versa. If you look at socialism, the democratic socialist countries of Europe, you will see that the government is shrinking relative to the marketplace. So take Sweden. In the early 1990s, government spending in Sweden was over 70% of the economy. Today, it's roughly 50%. And that's happening throughout Western Europe. So, if anything, as I said, liberalism isn't becoming socialism. Socialism may be becoming liberalism. Now, the marketplace has many virtues, including, including the fact that incentives, rewards, and losses are put in the right place, which is huge, and which government almost certainly won't do. But at the same time, we need business to recognize the imperfections of the marketplace and to be willing to do something about it. Here are just some of the flaws of the marketplace, and not necessarily an exhaustive list. The most obvious flaw in the marketplace is what are called externalities. Externalities are pollution. It means a business can impose its costs onto other people. If I'm imposing carbon on the entire world and don't have to clean it up, that means I don't have to, quote unquote, internalize those costs. It costs me nothing to impose my costs onto you. That is an obvious marketplace flaw. The marketplace does nothing to force businesses to internalize their costs. Another flaw is risk. And I should add that with many of these flaws, someone could stand up and say, no, that's a virtue. Yes, many of the marketplace flaws do have a positive impact, but we have to recognize that they can be both flaws and virtues, and while not eliminating them as virtues, we need to do something about them as flaws. So risk is another marketplace flaw. If you do not have the money to handle risk, you are in big trouble. What do free market economists say? Oh, they say you can handle risk, just go out and buy insurance. Well, guess what? The Conference Board says that over 30% of the American people have no discretionary income whatsoever with which to buy insurance. And let's take a step away from that just for a second to look at discretionary income. This is another problem of liberal framing. As you know, we're talking about inequality, and when we talk about inequality, we're talking about household income. Look how much difference there is in household income. And that's one way of looking at it, obviously. But perhaps a more important way of looking at it is discretionary income, that is, income after necessities. Okay, now we're looking at the fact that, as I said, over 30%, close to 40% of the American people have no discretionary income whatsoever. And then another, 10 to 20% barely have any. So we know what happens with people who don't have the ability to buy insurance. But then we also know that if you focus in on the next, on the 20% who have a slight bit of discretionary income, people are going to make bad choices. I mean, when your money's that tight, you're not necessarily going to spend it on insurance. In fact, a book was just written recently called Scarcity, which goes into the bad decisions people make when their money is tight. This is why we need universal insurance, as we've done with Social Security, unemployment, workers' comp, and even our bank accounts. So obviously we need it for healthcare and any other area where risk is too much for people to handle. And I want to add that national insurance is not socialism. Okay, it would be socialism if all the doctors worked for the government. But when we're talking about insurance, we're talking about having a marketplace, but mitigating the flaws of the marketplace. The next flaw is lack of freedom. Again, the free marketers just frame it in terms of government versus the market versus the individual. But no, if you have no money, you have no freedom. I've already mentioned that nearly 40% of Americans have no discretionary income, which means that they have political freedom, but their economic freedom, their everyday life freedom, is extremely limited if it exists at all. Another flaw, of course, is inadequate information. Again, conservatives say, let the marketplace handle it. People will pay for it when they need information. But when consumers don't have the money to pay for it, bad choices are going to be made. Consumers will be harmed, and the marketplace will actually be distorted. And just as an aside, my company, Better World Club, is looking at one aspect of this now, which is consumers need to have information on a company's actions beyond price and quality. That's why we're looking to launch Buying Power, which will provide social ratings, including environmental, labor, safety, and social impact at the product level for thousands of products. And afterwards, thank you. We're looking to launch it before the end of the year, I hope. If anybody wants to discuss it afterwards, I'm happy to do so. The next flaw is luck. And I guess I could mention Donald Trump here. Some think that choosing your parents is a skill, but I think most of us would agree that it's actually luck. So should capitalism depend on luck and inheritance? The Republicans are going to do away with the estate tax the next time they get in power unless we dedicate the tax. The most popular taxes are dedicated. Social Security taxes, gasoline taxes. People may be trying to mitigate them. George Bush is a good example. He was trying to change Social Security, but he wasn't trying to do away with Social Security taxes. We should be looking at the estate tax and figuring out how we should dedicate it. My argument would be, let's dedicate it to a purpose that parallels what estate taxes, what estates are about, which is inheritance. That is, we could take the $20 billion in revenue, divide it among the 4 million births, that's $5,000, put that in an estate tax, in a equity fund for all newborns. That $5,000 at historic rates would grow to $200,000 in today's dollars by the time people are 60. And at that time, depending on their need, what we would be encouraging them to do is to give it to the next generation, so that virtually every single American would inherit somewhere between $200,000 and $400,000. Now compare that in today's dollars. Now compare that to what is going on today, when half of all Americans own no equities whatsoever, and the median that people own is roughly $80,000. So basically, you'd be changing America by turning the estate tax into capitalism for all. The final flaw that I want to point out is lowest common denominator. And many times lowest common denominator when it comes to the price side can be good. But when it comes to wages, salaries, et cetera, it often is very bad. And that leads to our need for regulation. That's right, I'm a business person advocating for regulation, because we need regulation to deal with the lowest common denominator, as well as many of the other issues that I've already mentioned. So if I want to provide family leave, if I want to provide a higher wage, if I want to provide any number of a living wage to my employees, the marketplace just may not let me do so. Okay, we may need regulation to keep the marketplace playing field even in the best possible way. So, what's really going on is we have a new economy. As I already said, this is not the 20th century anymore. And there are just two huge factors that both business people and progressives are not facing up to adequately. The first is globalization. Okay. So how do I know that globalization is having this kind of effect? Well, back Franklin Roosevelt's deficit, federal budget deficit, was 4.25% of the economy, of gross domestic product. Ronald Reagan's deficit was 5.25%. Obama's deficit was 10.25%. Roosevelt's deficit reduced unemployment by 40% in 3 years. Reagan's reduced unemployment by roughly 36% in 3 years. Obama's reduced unemployment by 20% in 3 years. So why does a deficit that's twice as big reduce unemployment half as much? Well, I would argue that globalization is the reason that our money's now going over all over the world, and it's true of any economic model. Our money, whether it's monetarism, whether it's Keynesianism, whether it's supply side, our money is all over the world, and therefore not having the same impact. There's a check on that too, is if you look at growth rates in the various recoveries to recessions, you will see that they're always declining, that they were at their peak in the early 50s, and then they've declined, and people talk about how great Reagan's economy was, but it wasn't even as good as Johnson's economy in the 60s, and again, I would argue that that's because of globalization. Meanwhile, the other huge factor, obviously, is technology and what's going on with technology. Now, of course, it's one of the toughest issues to confront because technology does create jobs as well as destroy them. But some recent economic studies have said that most of the 6 million in manufacturing that we've lost has been because of technology. How many people here know what the #1 male occupation in this country is? Anybody want to take a guess? The #1 male occupation is driving. Trucking, delivery, taxis, limos. And we're on the threshold of driverless cars, right? Uber, which is out advertising for drivers, is already started testing driverless cars in Pittsburgh. What will be the impact of that? And if driverless cars are safer, by the way, as advertised, what will happen to the jobs of body shops and repair shops? Now, as I've already noted, globalization and technology do have their advantages, and you can make a case that overall income will increase from either one of them. But should that justify it if almost all the benefits go to the top 1%, go to the top 25%? We need to be looking at what the impact of all of this is on the bottom 50%. Now, I want to be clear. I believe in free trade. I believe in free trade with Canada and Europe, countries that have similar consumer, environmental, and labor laws that we do. When we're trading with other people without tariffs or anything, then obviously we're undermining those very laws and the people who benefit from them. So we need to figure out how to get money into people's hands, even apart from work. Okay, one model, if people here or some people here might be somewhat familiar with it, was the Alaska Permanent Fund. In the Alaska Permanent Fund, people receive a check every year from oil royalties. Recently, every Alaskan got $2,000, man, woman, and child, which means if you had a family of 4, you got a check for $8,000, which is significant. We need to be looking at that at the national level. Okay, you could have carbon tax money, you could have broadcast spectrum money, you could have any number of sources that would put money into people's hands. We also need to figure out how to make it easier for employees to earn a share of the businesses they work for. And then we need the universal trust funds that I mentioned above. So, as I mentioned, we need capitalism for all, where people would still manage their money. There would still be the marketplace. They would not be dependent on the government per se, but they'd have the opportunity to grow their assets. But it's necessary because we all understand the marketplace isn't perfect. What can people here do? Well, first of all, if business people are not if you're not a business person, then you need to be talking about the flaws of the marketplace with your parents, your friends, and other business people. If you are a business person, we need you to look at business for social responsibility. We need you to look at the American Sustainable Business Council, but we also need you to consider joining your own Chamber of Commerce and starting to talk about this stuff to other business people whose instincts may not be may not be ours. Anyway, Capitalism for All is a form of civil engagement and a response to the new economy that business people should be able to support. Conservatives support the Alaska Permanent Fund, so perhaps they will support Capitalism for All as well. Thank you very much.
For our next talk, it's going to be a panel discussion with Ralph Nader and Kim O'Neill, and they're going to discuss the new Citizen Library. Kim O'Neill has been a school teacher in Liverpool, New York for 35 years, and she also served on the National Board of Middle School and Childhood Generalist Standards Committee. She currently sits on the board of directors for the National Council for the Social Studies and the Commissioner's Advisory Panel for the New York State Social Studies Education Department.
Few people know what's going on in the schools as Kim O'Neill does, both as a teacher and a long-time high-level official in the National Association of Social Studies Teachers. So I just want to frame the discussion with what I mean by a new citizen library. There is no citizen library in the United States, in the world, as far as I know. This would not only be a library that would do traditional library functions of archives and books and digital information sources, but it would be a teaching library, both direct and by remote technologies. It would take a successful pilot project here and tell everybody about it and show how others can do the same thing. So you have an emulator function. It would propose new ways that people have written about, but they haven't yet applied into how to create thousands of citizen groups. We need thousands of citizen groups, local, state, national. When we look at how we progressed in this country, it's because we have a handful of citizen groups. So how do you start a local neighborhood group? How do you start a national group? How do you start an international group? How do you fund it? What are the mechanisms? Who do you go to? How do you recruit good people? There need to be hundreds of thousands of new jobs in this civil society that are not charity jobs, they're justice jobs. A society that has more justice needs less charity. Like soup kitchens we have, and they're important for hungry people to have food, but why do we have a country that has to have soup kitchens? We're rich enough so people can have a good livelihood and not have to go to soup kitchens. So that's the difference between justice and charity. So I want to start the discussion with what is the field of opportunity where a citizen library, should it ever get funded by either some rich people or foundations, what would be the field of opportunity? It would obviously be students, it would be schools. That's where you would start. The earlier, the better. The earlier, the faster. And we've all been to grade school and high school. I considered it a huge waste of time. I think you could teach everything in 8 years in 2 years and find something else for the kids to do if they can be kept off the street. And it isn't because the teachers don't want to teach it. It's the bureaucracy, it's the red tape, it's the pacification strategy of those who have control over the society. It's a lack of imagination. There are great examples here, there, all over the country in schools, but they don't get diffused over thousands of schools. That's one of the problems that bureaucracy generates. So let me start. When we talked on the phone, Kim, you mentioned that social studies are under tremendous pressure because Leave No Child Behind and they emphasize the sciences and math, but the humanities, history, politics, study of government, economics, that leads possibly to free thinking. That's pretty dangerous. And so this could be education in contrast to training, computer design, code, that sort of thing. So let me ask you, tell us what the situation is in thousands of schools around the country in social studies. And first, for those who don't know what social studies covers, the subject, just quickly define it.
Very quickly, it would be all the disciplines: geography, history, civics, economics, the social sciences. We're very inclusive. We like everybody. And it's just a great honor to be here, and I love to be in a room that looks like I'm in a social studies classroom, so thank you very much for choosing this. That's quite appropriate. To tell you what is the state of social studies, I would have you just picture an electric stove, 4-burner. And the 2 front burners, pots are on there, they're boiling away, things are going crazy, and you could think of that as your English and math. The back 2 burners, the next one's, it's going okay. Maybe it's not boiling over, but that's science. And then the other one, remember it's electric stove, the burner's turned off, but at least the lid's on the pot, and that's social studies. Because at this point, we are so marginalized, it's unbelievable. In the elementary classroom, if you're getting 15 minutes a week of social studies, that's unbelievable. That's the truth. I mean, that's what's out there. It's so marginalized. And you want to say, well, why is that? And you mentioned it with No Child Left Behind, because they were like, well, let us have the schools have a report card. Let's make them accountable. Let's have assessments. Social studies isn't tested. So at first, we're like, oh, we're not going to have to be involved in any of this. Isn't that something? But if you're not tested, you're not counted. So therefore, there are no funds put towards the content. It's unbelievable. So the National Council for the Social Studies, of which I'm the past president, of course, we have one lobbyist. I like the group you said that had 400, but we have one. And then those of us on the board will go to the Hill and we'll meet with our representatives. And I'm thinking, well, I'm with the choir, right? Because everybody there must be a political scientist major, right? Right? So I thought everybody would be pro-social studies education, and they just go, well, we really don't have anybody who's heading that department, but we'll give you our STEM person. So I meet with them, and I said, isn't this sort of an oxymoron that you all are here, and this is your interest, but you don't support social studies education? And I go, I grew up in the Cold War. Maybe this is a conspiracy or something. I don't know. And they said I was giving Washington too much credit. But it's very serious. It's very serious. And when I see it here today and I listen to you want engaged citizens, you want people invested in democracy, we want people to feel empowered, we want critical thinkers, exposure to a range of perspectives. I'm sitting there going, isn't this social studies? But yet, we here are under this marginalization that is just frightening and for the foundation of democracy. So I sound like a rabble-rouser and scaring you, but you need to know about this.
Well, what about the social studies teachers? How many thousands of them, and why don't they organize and have a full-time group to advance and protect their careers by having a full-time group of advocates who can be one step removed and have the social studies teachers feed them all the information and how the propagandists are eroding the most important subjects in school. I mean, these are the most important subjects. Our founding fathers, when they went to Philadelphia in 1787, as far as I know, none of them were experts in stagecoach technology. They knew jurisprudence, philosophy, sociology, history. That's what they brought to their deliberations. So what are all the social studies teachers doing? I've addressed the social studies teacher convention, and it is a big convention. So you got a lot of numbers. Are they intimidated? Are they frightened? Lack of leadership? Are they worried about the boards of education, the corporate influence, the politicians in City Hall? What's your view on that?
Well, first of all, we have 10,000 members compared to, say, other groups, other content areas that may have 60,000. When I spoke with someone, I said, how is your membership? They go, I won't tell you the group. But they go, oh, it's really dropped. I'm like, oh, yeah? They go, yeah, we're only 60,000. We had 100. And I'm like, oh, well, we're 10. We had 20 to 30. So you're saying, why aren't social studies teachers out there? They are, but again, you have to realize that only half of the states require government and civics as a requirement to be taught in the high school. So your level of number of teachers that are out there wouldn't be the same as in some of the other classes.
This is amazing. I had no idea it was that
I'm
small.
so happy to tell Ralph Nader.
Yeah, if you cut the number of time, you cut the number of teachers, right? Okay, so what about the parents? You don't need 80% of the parents to be concerned about this. What about 2-3%? Are they worried that their children are not being taught how to be good citizens, how to be skilled citizens, how to stand up for their rights, how to pursue their aspirations?
Well, when you talk about the testing, again, as we're saying, if it's not tested, there's this perception that it's not important. And when you start that and you build upon that, and this has been going on now since 2001, and it's just perseverated that now we get into the Common Core, that all went crazy, and people were so focused on the math and the ELA. And that's been where the monies are. I now work for, I'm retired, but before I retired, I became a national board certified teacher. And because I worked on the standards committee, I have now worked for them. And what we've been able to do is to take a look at certified teachers' videos that they submit. And we're able to look at those and pull out, what are the social studies pieces of accomplished teaching that you can see. One of them is Take Action. So, we're getting it in there. But in order to be funded by that, it's a nonprofit, so the grants that were coming in, I'd go, oh, do we have one? Can we do the social studies yet? And they'd say to me, well, Kim, they wanted to do science. So it was so hard to get anyone to be any kind of grant funded for social studies.
The foundations aren't stepping
They're
up?
not interested.
Ford Foundation, Rockefeller, MacArthur, none.
Let's meet some. The ones that are truly...
Let's bridge science courses with what social studies courses should be concerned about. Let's say you got high school students in chemistry courses, biology courses, physics courses. They usually have labs. And let's say as part of the curriculum, they test the local drinking water. So there's a periodic report from the students of Ajax High School on the local drinking water. They learn how to do protocols in heavy metal testing, cadmium, arsenic, lead, etc. And they then learn a bit about the drinking water safety law, what their rights are, what the local municipality has to report to them periodically about what's in the drinking water or how underinvested they are in the public works. What happens when you take advantage of this tilt toward so-called science, STEM, etc., and you bridge the two? Would that be controversial?
Some areas are doing that. Some schools that I actually know are doing that. It's just that it's not necessarily being done. So it can be done. So, you have a lot of pieces to put together there. Primarily, that might be something more in a higher, say, secondary level.
Let's take another one. And our C-SPAN audience might want to pitch in their local schools with some of these ideas, as well as our live stream. Let's say you had a government class in high school, and the teacher decided to have a part of the course do a voting record of the local state legislature or Congress. Let's call it Congress 101 or State Legislature 101, where they look over the voting records, what the campaign finance pattern is for their lawmakers. They try to interview them. They put it out on the internet so it reaches a large audience. The politicians know the students are going to do this. It really gets them interested in government because they see how important they become. Just by sheer knowledge about what their legislators are doing, they distribute it all over in the districts. Would that be too controversial? It's a good way to teach civics.
Yeah, I don't think it'd be controversial. It'd be depending on where you'd be able to do it. If it'd be a high school, what level, middle school, depending on what the report card was for the testing, the middle school might be very limited in the social studies classes. There might be, again, that push towards the ELA. So because social studies isn't necessarily mandated in middle schools, so you have that little bit of a leeway there where it's not taught. So sometimes you're finding groups, a gap, among students, depending on what schools they go to, what areas, as to who's actually getting any civics education.
But what about the standardized curriculum? Will that eliminate any kind of individual initiative like this by this physics teacher or the chemistry teacher?
It often comes right down to districts, say New York. It could be different states. I don't know many different states, but sometimes it's at the district level. You can have a state standards, state framework, and from within that, the districts control.
How do you think the students would react? I mean, one of the problems with students, short attention span, nonstop looking at their cell phone, and being bored. And that's what I hear, being bored and so forth. Do you think this would really excite students? I mean, they become very important in the community, let me tell you. I've seen.
I totally agree, and just personally what I did, it was more through grants, were things that I did with my students in the community, because that was always trying to be the reach that I was trying to do. But if it's not written in, I'd not necessarily say it's going to be happening.
There was a fifth grade student in Salt Lake City about 20 years ago. You probably heard about her because she got national attention. A little girl came in and said, there's a waste dump down the street, and the teacher said, what do you mean? And so she took the teacher down, and it was a whole square block that was covered with shrubbery. It turned out it was a waste dump. And so she put the students on the project, and they had press releases. It became minor celebrities. They cleaned up. The mayor ordered the cleanup, and so the teacher wrote a book on kids and social action for all teachers. And she found the fifth graders incredibly mature. You know how young people are. If you have low expectations of them, they'll oblige you. If you have high expectations, they'll surprise you. So she was really surprised. And Salt Lake is kind of conservative, Utah, but this affected everybody. It didn't matter what the ideology was. People don't like, cloistered toxic waste dumps. Let's take the fifth grade. I've often told by teachers that the peak of idealism and imaginative questioning is about 11 or 12. After that, they have other things on their mind. And by the way, Ronald Reagan was more terrified being questioned by teenagers than any of the press corps. And one of them once said to Ronald Reagan, asked a question right out of the blue, and Ronald Reagan blurted out, 80% of pollution comes from trees. Well, not many reporters would provoke that kind of response. So what do you think of the 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th grade for really getting down into civics, practical civics, learning about their community, going to the historical society, learning about the rivers and lakes and woods and whatever?
I think you should
Parks.
be a superintendent, or at least be doing some curriculum writing. I mean, it's what was done. It truly was what was done. We had tremendous social studies programs. And again, because of this testing and this focus, and that's where your funding's coming from, we was just marginalized. And when I talked about the pot on the back, remember I said it was an electric stove, so there's still a little bit of energy, still in that burner, even though it's off. And that pot had the lid on. I mean, we still feel social studies is sizzling. We had, our own national standards put out, the College Career and Civic Life, called C3. And within those 4 dimensions, one is take informed action. So it's there. New York State put it into their framework, which is, where I'm from. We had a commissioner at the time who took the only state to take Race to the Top monies and put it into social studies. The only state. He happens now to be the Secretary of Education, John King.
Yeah.
So, we're very pleased about that. But
I think we're neglecting that age group tremendously, because
Well-
I once was chatting up with a group of 10-year-olds, and you can't believe the questions. Look at the imagination. It's snuffed out a few years later. Girl stands up and asks me the question, why does Coca-Cola cost more than gasoline? He said, yeah, that's when it was. He said, a gallon of Coca-Cola costs more than a gallon of gasoline. And she says, sort of simple, Coca-Cola. See the imagination there? To even ask that kind of question, because gasoline, you got to get the oil, fracking, refine it, ship it, and so forth. And It comes in cheaper than Coca-Cola, which is, you know, water and a formula, as I said earlier today, from Atlanta, and some sugar. And then someone else asked me that they were figuring out, this is when you had long distance calls, they couldn't figure out why it costs more to phone New York to Los Angeles while someone could fly from New York to Los Angeles cheaper. So long distance call costs more for 5 hours than getting on a plane flying. I'm saying to myself, look at the combination of imagination here that's snuffed out by a whole variety of things. My sister Claire started a little bakery project in Connecticut for 5th graders. You can't believe how excited they were to bake their own bread, something real. And they took it home to their families and said, look, I baked this bread. And we had someone come up and talk to them about grain and yeast and, you know, all the processes before they got the flour. So in a simple question, give me your most revolutionary thoughts.
Of getting social studies education back on the burner?
Yeah.
I really feel if there's a way that we can collaborate, be it the various organizations, the content areas to work together. Right now we're trying to do that with science because they don't feel they're, you know, right on the docket. It's other organizations if we can just work together to get the word out there because we're just sort of by ourselves and people they can't believe it. They can't believe that it's happening. So how we go about that, as you say, trying to get membership, we've tried and tried, obviously hasn't worked. How do we get our membership working together and being advocates? And what I really think, we've spent time at the Hill, I think it has to be right back door to door. I think it has to be right back in our own communities. And that's really where I think the focus is going to have to be to let something happen. How do we do that? We turn to you, I guess.
There is a drive for experiential education, as they call it. What do you think of that? That's, you know, where you give the students experience.
Well, I mean, in a sense, social studies, we're all in this inquiry arc. We're into the compelling questions. So actually, that's how we want to teach it. It's not the memorization that maybe some of us have grown up with. It truly has come with a question. You know, why can't we get everything we want? Present that to even seniors, actually. You know, as a topic, as a question, get involved in the rights and so on. So that's really the way we want to teach social studies. We want to do it, but
give the audience around the country your website.
NCSS.org is the National Council for the Social Studies website, so NCSS.org. And in front of that, you can just say K. O'Neil, 1L, O-N-E-I-L, at NCSS.org. And we will certainly work with you, with our state councils, to revolutionize and get social studies education truly back into the classrooms.
Do you have materials that you can send to them?
We sure do.